Greetings and welcome to Session 6. Today we're studying and discussing the book How Democracies Die by two Harvard political science professors, Levitsky and Ziblatt. Some of the central facts which Levitsky and Ziblatt share with us and discuss with us are pretty familiar to us. Support for democratic values in terms of public opinion polls, for example, has fallen in Western democracies over the past 2 decades. We've seen the rise of strongmen leaders, anti-democratic leaders in Hungary, Poland, India, Brazil, Turkey, and the United States, who have systematically undermined and delegitimized the electoral institutions of democracy in their countries and in other countries. And of course, we remember the grim history of the 20th century, which saw the rise of fascist dictatorships in Germany, Italy, Spain, and many other countries, all of which displaced existing democracies. In this study, How Democracies Die, Levitsky and Ziblatt are engaged in a comparative and empirical study of the decline of democratic institutions and values worldwide, but with special attention to the situation in the United States. These two men are professors and well-respected professors of government or political science at Harvard, and they are comparativists. They study comparative politics. And what this means is that they study similar political circumstances and regimes and then attempt to understand and discover the mechanisms and processes which recur in different national settings. Their book identifies the mechanisms and strategies through which authoritarian leaders and parties systematically pursue and entrench power. And this is political science and political theory because it's reasoning about what are the strategic opportunities which exist to unprincipled anti-democratic leaders. It's important to underline that this book is not a piece of journalism. It is not a piece of opinion writing or editorial commentary or blogging. Rather, it is an empirical study based on the methods of comparative politics which have been used for, well, really, Alexis de Tocqueville was a comparative sociologist, political scientist, so 200 years, but certainly intensively since World War II. According to the methods of comparative politics, regimes and political systems are looked at as being historically embodied complexes of institutions, values, parties, political interests, and populations. Comparative political scientists attempt to discover the dynamics and common pathways through which modern democracies function. Here's the way that they describe the value of international comparison. Quoting from the book, "Studying other democracies in crisis allows us to better understand the challenges facing our own. For example, based on the historical experiences of other nations, we have developed a litmus test to help identify would-be autocrats before they come to power. We can learn from the mistakes that past democratic leaders have made in opening the door to would-be authoritarians, and conversely, from the ways that other democracies have kept extremists out of power. A comparative approach also reveals how elected autocrats in different parts of the world employ remarkably similar strategies to subvert democratic institutions. As these patterns become visible, the steps towards breakdown grow less ambiguous and easier to combat." Their central point is that anti-democratic political power has changed its nature since the 1930s. Seizure of power, whether in Europe or in Latin America, by force, making use of the armed forces, is no longer typical of the rise of new dictatorships. We have seen many countries in which existing democracies have been subverted by authoritarian leaders and parties who have competed, at least initially, through traditional democratic means. These processes have been slow and less dramatic than the seizure of power by dictators such as Hitler, Mussolini, Franco, and many, many others in European history. but they have resulted in a great reduction in the real effectiveness of democratic institutions and systems in many countries, including Turkey, Brazil, Hungary, Poland, and India. And these authors believe that the potential for such death of democracy is very real in the United States, especially since the presidency of Donald Trump, but not only limited to the period since 2016. So what about the US democracy? Here again, I'll quote a terrific passage, in fact, one of the opening passages of the book. But now we find ourselves turning to our own country. Over the past 2 years, we have watched politicians say and do things that are unprecedented in the United States, 2018, remember, but that we recognize as having been the precursors of democratic crisis in other places. We feel dread, as do so many other Americans, even as we try to reassure ourselves that things can't really be that bad here. After all, even though we know democracies are always fragile, the one in which we live has somehow managed to defy gravity. Our Constitution, our national creed of freedom and equality, our historically robust middle class, our high levels of wealth and education, and our large, diversified private sector, all these should inoculate us from the kinds of democratic breakdown that have occurred elsewhere. And yet, January 6th, 2021. Quoting again, "But there is another way to break a democracy. It is a less dramatic but equally destructive way. Democracies may die at the hands not of generals but of elected leaders, presidents or prime ministers who subvert the very process that brought them to power. Some of these leaders dismantle democracy quickly, as Hitler did in the wake of the 1933 Reichstag fire in Germany. More often, though, democracies erode slowly in barely visible steps." Again quoting, "We know that extremist demagogues emerge from time to time in all societies, even in healthy democracies. The United States had its share of them, including Henry Ford, Huey Long, Joseph McCarthy, and George Wallace. An essential test for democracies is not whether such figures emerge, but whether political leaders, and especially political parties, work to prevent them from gaining power in the first place by keeping them off mainstream party tickets, refusing to endorse or align with them, and when necessary, making common cause with rivals in support of democratic candidates. Isolating popular extremists requires political courage, but when fear, opportunism, or miscalculation leads established parties to bring extremists into the mainstream, democracy is imperiled." These are very important words today in the current circumstances in which we find ourselves. Are there guardrails for democracy? Can we be confident in the United States that our democracy is secure because there are institutional and broadly shared democratic values which serve as guardrails or protections against seizure of power, authoritarian actions by a president? Levitsky and Ziblatt were concerned in 2018, almost 3 years ago now, that the guardrails of our democracy were not sufficiently stable to prevent the emergence of an authoritarian leader. That is a very strong statement by two very respected political science professors. Quoting, "But are constitutional safeguards by themselves enough to secure a democracy? We believe the answer is no. Even well-designed constitutions sometimes fail." Again, a really serious caution. Recent events, in fact, seem to show how close our country came to rejection of a legitimate election in November 2020 through pressure on these very institutions. Personal phone calls by the president to secretaries of state in contested states around the country. It appears we now have a new president, popularly elected by more than 7 million votes. It would appear the guardrails held, but I think any perceptive and honest observer would say it was a very close call. So our authors offer 4 warning signs, what they call the litmus test, warning signs of a slide towards authoritarianism, a slide towards the death of democracy. 4 processes which we should be watching for. Number 1, rejection of or weak commitment to democratic rules of the game by candidates and by parties. Number 2, denial of the legitimacy of political opponents. Number 3, toleration or encouragement of violence. And number 4, readiness to curtail civil liberties of opponents, including media. Our authors illustrate these 4 warning signs in other countries, in Turkey and in Hungary, for example. But any one of us could give examples of each of these 4 of political behavior in the past 6 months, 12 months, and several years in our national politics. Rejection of democratic rules of the game, denial of the legitimacy of political opponents, toleration of violence, and a readiness to curtail civil liberties. So what they're really talking about is a piecemeal assault on democracy, an undermining of the institutions and values of democracy by individuals, leaders, and parties whose ambition is to wield authoritarian power. Again, a quote that I think is important. How do elected authoritarians shatter the democratic institutions that are supposed to constrain them? Some do it in one fell swoop. But more often, the assault on democracy begins slowly. For many citizens, it may at first be imperceptible. After all, elections continue to be held. Opposition politicians still sit in Congress. Independent newspapers still circulate. The erosion of democracy takes place piecemeal, often in baby steps. Each individual step seems minor. None appears to truly threaten democracy. Indeed, government moves to subvert democracy frequently enjoy a veneer of legality. They are approved by Parliament or ruled constitutional by the Supreme Court. Many of them are adopted under the guise of pursuing some legitimate, even laudable public objective, such as combating corruption, cleaning up elections, improving the quality of democracy, or enhancing national security. Another relevant quote, to entrench themselves in power, however, governments must do more once they have won election. They must also change the rules of the game. Authoritarians seeking to consolidate their power often reform the Constitution, the electoral system, and other institutions in ways that disadvantage or weaken the opposition, in effect tilting the playing field against their rivals. These reforms are often carried out under the guise of some public good, while in reality they are stacking the deck in favor of the incumbents. And because they involve legal and even constitutional changes, they may allow autocrats to lock in these advantages for years or even decades. Again, I think if you think back over our recent history, 1 year, 4 years, 20 years, you'll see many of these changes in terms of voter registration, voter eligibility, voter locations, the effort to suppress the vote in some states and some parts of some states. So what are the key institutions of the American democracy, and how might they be subverted? The Constitution and the system of law regulating elections and voting. Certainly a key institution in U.S. democracy. The judicial system, and in particular the federal judiciary, which has the responsibility of ensuring that constitutional provisions are observed. Third, the political parties and the selection of candidates. This is a key institutional arrangement in the United States, which is not, doesn't play the same role in every country, but in the United States, it's a key institution of U.S. democracy. Fourth, the funding process of elections and candidates through vast campaign funds and political action committees, and the possibility, really the likelihood, the inevitability of the influence of big donors. Fifth, the role of traditional media and newspapers in influencing public opinion, but then counterpart to that, social media and the spread of false stories, myths about political opponents, conspiracy theories, and mobilizing of opinion, making use of social media. Again, I think it's pretty evident in the past 20 years that right-wing television networks, which have developed very large audiences, are one of the institutions of existing US democracy. And then finally, corporations, wealthy individuals, labor unions, and other large organizations play a role as well in the US democracy. So the authors provide a really alarming picture of institutional change in the United States. What is their purpose for doing that? It is not to write the elegy for American democracy. Rather, it is to help us as citizens see the processes which are going on around us every day, and then to be prepared to both reinforce our institutions, reinforce the guardrails, to defend the freedom of the press, to defend elected officials who do their job, whether it's the Secretary of State in Georgia or the elected electors who certified the vote in Michigan. We as citizens need to understand that attacks on these officials are attacks on democracy. And what these authors are demonstrating to us is that we need to have our eyes open. We need to be paying attention to the processes which have been witnessed in many different countries, and we can see many of those processes underway in the United States as well. I like this closing quote in their book, which technically I don't think you read for today, but I'll read it to you. The egalitarianism, civility, sense of freedom, and shared purpose portrayed by E.B. White were the essence of mid-20th century American democracy. Today, that vision is under assault. To save our democracy, Americans need to restore the basic norms that once protected it, but we must do more than that. We must extend those norms through the whole of a diverse society. We must make them truly inclusive. America's democratic norms at their core have always been sound, but for much of our history they were accompanied, indeed sustained, by racial exclusion. Now those norms must be made to work in an age of racial equality and unprecedented ethnic diversity. Few societies in history have managed to be both multiracial and genuinely democratic. That is our challenge. It is also our opportunity. If we meet it, America will be truly exceptional. Great, thank you.